Hello everyone, welcome back to another dose of APUSH. We're reaching the end of historical period number 6. We've got key concept 6.3.1 today, social responses to the Gilded Age. So, we've looked at a lot of what industrialization has looked like, what urbanization has been like, what immigration has been like. All this is really occurring within this age that you could call the Industrial Age. Others call it the Gilded Age. It refers to a quotation by Mark Twain that I'll show you later on in this presentation. But realize it's just this term that means that it looks gold on the surface, but it's pretty cheap underneath. Okay, so it's kind of has a negative connotation of this era that sure there's a lot of progress, but most of everything actually isn't going that well. So we're going to look at how society responds to the changes brought on by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and how American society is changing because of these previous changes from industrialization. Alright, so first we're going to talk about mostly the topic of social Darwinism. Okay, so if you took AP Euro last year, hopefully this term sounds a little bit familiar because it was happening in Europe as well. Okay, so first we have to understand what that Darwinism part means. So I'm assuming you've learned about this in science, biology at some point. So in 1859, Charles Darwin was a British scientist, traveled to the Galapagos Islands, observes a lot of things going on with animals there and how they were isolated from the mainland, and isolated from each other on different islands, and he published his findings in a book called On the Origin of Species. And what he introduced in there was the idea of natural selection, which was his thought, his theory on what determines how certain species, how certain genetic traits survive, and how others die out. His idea is that if we look at sort of time as this, this vast spectrum, where if you look at things over thousands of years instead of just within human history or even a human lifetime, we can see that there's going to be this natural selection where those that have certain mutations, certain genetic predispositions to help them survive, will survive, and eventually those that don't have it are going to be less likely to reproduce, which makes them then less likely to survive and pass on those traits. That was his idea. It was controversial at the time, and we're going to talk about in the 1920s how it was still very controversial. But you just need to have a little bit of background on what his idea was for when we apply it to this Gilded Age mentality. Fast forward a few years, there was a guy named Herbert Spencer who applied it to society and called it social Darwinism. His thought was that if you take this idea and you apply it to society and the economy, the rich and the strong thrive and survive, while the weak and the poor suffer and die out. And what it essentially did is it justified the huge gap between the classes and the creation of classes within this sort of unfettered capitalism that was going on. Things were not regulated, and we saw an increasing divide between the very wealthy and the very poor. Well, if you have this idea that those who get ahead, that are wealthy and strong, they are so because of some genetic predisposition. If you're poor, you are weak, and you suffer and die out. Okay? So it was a way that business leaders often defended their wealth. Obviously, they looked at their past and said, look at how much work I've put into this. There must be a reason why this happened, and science seems to explain it. However, it also justified pretty much classifying, 75% of the population as inferior in some way. Okay? So it's going to create essentially not just sort of inequality that's going on in society in terms of socioeconomic status, but it's also going to create ideas of why those different statuses exist in the first place. Now, even an uglier thing to come out of this was the eugenics movement. Alright, so eugenics is kind of the next step of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, just this idea that this is why there's such a divide within socioeconomic status and classes. Eugenics says, well, if this is our theory behind why this exists, then we should prevent these inferior people, the weak and the poor, from reproducing so that we don't have their genetic traits passed on later on in history. So you can see that an idea eventually became this actual movement that would limit people's rights, limit their reproductive rights specifically. People typically aimed at through this movement were criminals, the mentally ill, or sort of race-based arguments. So some states had laws that said that criminals or the mentally ill could be sterilized so they could have medical procedures so they could not physically reproduce anymore. And you can see that was based on this idea that it was genetic, when we know that it's maybe a little bit genetic but not necessarily genetic. It has a lot to do with context as well. All right, some of these arguments would also kind of trickle down into race-based arguments, where, because if you look in the United States, there was this huge racial divide with Jim Crow laws. Americans are going to try to apply that to say why black people were inferior compared to white people. They said, well, if black people are doing so poorly in society, it must be because they're genetically inferior, not because circumstances forced them into that position for centuries. Okay, you can see that at the time it actually says Negroid sane criminals and Negroid criminal or civil insane. So talking about looking at physical features on someone to determine whether they are mentally inferior. Okay, we know that's just absolute garbage today. This is what we call pseudoscience, but back then it fed in through eugenics and social Darwinism. Okay, so science kind of had this uglier side to it too once people sort of applied it to society when that was not a proper application. I believe that Charles Darwin even disagreed with this application, saying that's not what I meant at all. He was talking about nature in general across centuries, or rather millennia, not just talking about human history, but talking about the history of life. Biology. Okay, because of social Darwinism, there were some changes on labor. So those who were the working poor, the working class, and those who were upper class. Okay, so before the Civil War, if you think of Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy, if people owned land, if they worked freely, one day they could save up enough money and eventually be successful. They could be entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are people that take risks using what money they have in order to get ahead. The idea was that if there was some support, just a little bit, and those people acted responsibly and accordingly, they could get ahead. But industrialization essentially changed the economy, which means that people weren't owning and working on land anymore. They were increasingly moving into urban centers rather living rurally. And we also see how those rural agrarians, right, they were having trouble getting by anyway. They could never save up money because they were perpetually in debt. So wage labor really alters this ideal. So there's no longer kind of as much of this sense of this American dream of Jeffersonian democracy that you could get ahead. But popular entertainment back then still perpetuated, where is it? It's not showing up. Give me a second. There we go. Popular ideas still promoted this. One of it was these fictional stories about Horatio Alger, and it was trying to show the possibility of rags to riches, where you start living in squalor in the cities, and then eventually you become rich through all that rugged individualism, self-determination, self-reliance. The fact is, this was pure fiction at the time. People strived for this ideal, but it was never possible, and in this time period, it was even less possible than it was before. All right, so we looked at kind of how society is shifting their points of view because of industrialization, and you can see it had some pretty negative effects. But what are business leaders and the wealthy doing with this wealth? You've got people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller that are the richest men in America and in the world at the time. They are not taxed by the government. There was no income tax at the time, and they're essentially making it so that capitalism serves them instead of capitalism promoting competition within the country. So some take steps forward to be philanthropic. Okay, one of these was Andrew Carnegie, and he developed something he called the Gospel of Wealth. And the term comes from an essay that we will read in class called Wealth, published in 1899, written by Carnegie to explain what he thinks should be done for people who have such immense wealth as he does. Okay, and what he essentially said is wealth like his can be used in three possible ways. One is to bequest it to your descendants and your children, and he essentially says this isn't a good thing because it means that your children and their descendants are not going to try for themselves when they can just rely on the wealth that you made for them. Okay, so he says this is not what I want to do with my money, though he would do it with some of his money. He could say, when you die, you can have no plans put in place, which means that it's going to be taken by the government. And he says, no, this isn't going to work out as well, because who knows if the government that you might have trusted while you were alive is going to be the same government later on. So basically, he says you can't leave your money to just sit there and then to be there for someone else to decide what to do once you're dead. It's not a trustworthy system. He said the only proper way to do it would be philanthropy. So the adjective there is philanthropic. A person would be a philanthropist. Okay? And he says, what should they do? Give it away within your own lifetime, and it's the only moral option of the three that he could think of. So what he's saying is, if you give away most of your wealth during your lifetime, you can make sure it's going to worthwhile causes that you deem worthwhile, because it's your money. So you should decide what to do with it. He also says in here at one point that he said most people who deserve this type of money are not in a place to need it because they're trying to get ahead on their own. So realize that this idea of philanthropy was dedicated to helping institutions, creating things that could provide some help, but never giving direct money to the poor. He was firmly against that, and he expresses that in this essay as well. So what did he do? He created thousands of libraries nationwide. We've got even the Carnegie Institute is something that still exists today based on his old wealth that was wisely invested over the years, and it still supports education in libraries and giving out money for worthwhile causes. He also works with another industrialist, I forget his first name, last name was Mellon, obviously, to create Carnegie Mellon University. Wait, scratch that. There was Carnegie University, there was Mellon University, and they eventually merged together. Okay, that's actually how the story goes. And a lot of rich people like Carnegie follow his examples. It's not always to libraries or education, but whatever kind of their pet project was, they would invest their money in that, hoping to leave it on to society and their institutions to take care of after their death. An example would be J.P. Morgan. He was a very wealthy banker at the time, so managing other people's money made him a lot of money. So if you think today, if you know of the banking company Chase, it's actually J.P. Morgan Chase. His name is still involved in this business. There's also Morgan Stanley, I think it's a stockbroking company, still tied into him. His legacy in terms of where he dedicated his money is he was a big art collector. And he collected so much art that most of his purchases became the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City today. A couple of other universities. There's Stanford University, named after Leland Stanford, a wealthy industrialist, and Vanderbilt University, named after Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad magnate. Okay, so they started to look at what Carnegie said to do, and then use that in order to figure out how to use some of their money so that it wasn't used unwisely after their deaths. Now, I kind of already said this, but just noted again that this type of philanthropy was dedicated toward institutions and movements and no direct money to the poor. So they still believed in laissez-faire economics, the invisible hand, strict unregulated capitalism. So what that means is they were giving away their money by choice, okay? And they were doing it to institutions that they saw as worthy of their attention. They did not trust the government to take their money and do the right thing, and they did not want to give it directly out to the poor because they thought the poor would become reliant on that instead of being self-reliant. So even though there is a lot of philanthropy going on here, it is limited to institutions and not really improving the situation of the poor. We'll read it in class, and Carnegie says again, the poor, the ones who truly deserve this type of help, actually don't need it because they're going to try and work through it by themselves and aren't going to rely on someone else. All right, our last slide right here. We're going to define the term Gilded Age for you and talk about some social responses, including kind of these idealists who are looking at what's going on with the Gilded Age. How can we fix society to control the effects of the Gilded Age? So, mentioned this before, the term Gilded Age was coined by good old Mark Twain in 1873. Mark Twain is one of the most famous humorists of possibly all American history. I think I told you his Congress little quip in class at one point. Okay, so he wrote in, he worked with another author, I forget who it was, but in a work kind of compiled stories called The Gilded Age. Okay, and what he said there was the golden gleam of the gilded surface hides the cheapness of the metal underneath. Now, gilding is a process where you take typically lead or some some base metal, something that's not very expensive, and you gild it, okay? So you essentially you use fire and various chemical processes to put a very thin veneer of gold on the top. So if you're wearing like a ring on your finger or a necklace, on the surface it looks like it's pure gold. It's golden, it's gleaming, it's gilded, it's shining, it's beautiful. But over time, that gilding might scratch off, and it's just this, you know, boring, useless, not useless, but kind of worthless metal underneath. And that's what he is using as a metaphor for this age, where certainly there was economic progress for our country. Our economy expanded. We were competing worldwide with other industrial economies. Technological process, the Bessemer process, oil refining, and what are some other ones? Banking. All this stuff really drove our economy forward to get where we are today. But if you basically scratch just a little bit off the surface, you are going to see that poverty and squalor was the vast majority of that progress and a result of it. Okay, so Mark Twain was being critical of the Gilded Age in his response. Okay, a couple of these other responses. The social gospel. So it was a Protestant church movement that sought to improve society through social welfare. We could start to tie this into the Third Great Awakening. We talked about the first and the second. Those ones are really important. Third Great Awakening isn't as big of a deal, okay, because religion pretty much was already involved in society. The shift here is, though, that churches are going to be focused on providing services for the needy to basically try and at least fill that gap a little where capitalism is not fixing it. So you can see it's a little bit tied in with the Second Great Awakening that the idea of good works can get you to heaven. So it's continuing that idea, but focused on the effects of industrialization and things in the Gilded Age. Major one of these is the Salvation Army, so still around today as a thrift store, a charity organization. It was originally a Protestant church, so like a sect, in the same way there's like the Presbyterians and the Methodists and all these different groups that fall under Protestantism. Salvation Army was a type of church. Okay, they're still around today more as a charity organization, legacy of the social gospel. Now, tied in with this, with the social gospel, and you can tie this in with, I'd say maybe utopians over on the left there as well, is Christian fundamentalism. It's a new approach to Christianity, Protestant Christianity I should say, and it starts to grow especially in the South. Now, the difference here is that they started to take a literal interpretation of the Bible, and that's what that word fundamental means. They looked at the words and said, this is all we have in terms of our religion. So we need to not so much rely on almost like secondary sources from people interpreting the Bible, but look directly at the Bible, at the source, almost like a strict interpretation of the Bible, and say, what happened, what does it mean, and that's what we're going to do. So they would look at things in the Old Testament and things like Genesis and Exodus at the very beginning, and say, oh, it said God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Well, look at your watch. I guess it took 6 days according to my watch. Okay? They were going to say things that when it said that, God covered up, the sun and caused darkness until, we'll talk about this in the 1920s. It's brought up in the Scopes monkey trial. But the idea that the world went dark for days, they said, well, it says it in the Bible, so it must have happened, even though we had enough astronomical knowledge to know at the time that that simply wasn't possible. Okay, so we talked about science before. Science and this type of literal interpretation of the Bible are going to come into conflict later on, but we'll talk about that in Historical Period 7, I believe. Now, the idea behind this was a similar idea to what was in the First and Second Great Awakenings, evangelicalism. Evangelical means spreading your ideas and converting others, but you can see there is this shift with interpreting the Bible literally. Okay, Third Great Awakening, resurgence of religious fervor. Like I said, it's not as critical to know as the First or Second Great Awakenings. Notice, the First and Second Great Awakenings are red terms. They are mentioned by name back in, let's see, Historical Periods 2 and 4, I believe. We're in number 6, and it's not even a term that's mentioned because it's not as critical. Know the social gospel and the Gilded Age instead. Those are the terms they want you to know. Now, a political response to finish us off to the Gilded Age were more radical political visions, and these are mostly coming from Europe that underwent industrialization a little bit before America. 3 major ones are anarchism, socialism, and communism. Okay? All these are responses to unfettered capitalism, that there were no regulations and it was creating poverty and squalor as a result of the outcome of this type of capitalism. So anarchists are saying that society is basically beyond repair, that we need to overthrow it and replace it with something that serves the people instead of the government serving itself and serving the rich. Okay? Socialism is the idea that the government should control and heavily regulate and often own the means of production. So that means that if you have oil reserves, if you have steel processes, if you have all this manufacturing, the government is either going to own those businesses themselves or regulate them extremely with lots of taxation and rules about what you can and cannot do. This came about because if you have the vast majority of your population being the urban working class poor, that's where they're involved, okay? So some people are getting very rich, and they're saying, well, the government is the thing that can come in and prevent this unequal distribution of incomes. They thought socialism would even it out. Now, an even more extreme version there is communism, in red because it's a term you need to know, and in red because red is the color of communism. Okay? This is the idea of socialism isn't even enough. There needs to be an overthrowal of capitalism to not just control the means of production of the government, but to seize them through a popular movement where there kind of almost is no government, but the people they themselves rule. Now, we'll talk about this later on, especially when it comes up in the Russian Revolution in 1917. There's some responses in America to that, so we'll save it for then. Just know for now that these movements are alternate political visions that got a lot of basically pushback and resistance in America, and they're all reactions to the excesses of the Gilded Age, where we get a big separation in kind of the income gap. The wealthy are very wealthy, the poor are very poor, and there is a middle class, but there's a vast sort of divide between them. All right, and there we are. Okay, thank you so much for watching. You know what you need to do. You got some term cards to create. Red preferred, yellow if you so desire. You've got a quiz to do on Google Classroom, due by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Geography to work on, chronology to study, and another video to watch if you're ready. So this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll see you in class. Bye.